Hello and welcome to What the Hey, where I'm your regular host of What the Hey, and today in What the Hey, I'm once again answering yet another question. When I go to my notebook of knowledge, I see the question of, who the hey are the Beatles? Now this question comes from Mason Griffin Wakefield, so hello to you and thank you very much for the question. Now, in terms of a very basic description, music groups and their fans are topics that usually still hold massive weight in today's society. The Beatles themselves were a group of men who produced music along different types of music genres. And because the Beatles tried to diversify the different kinds of songs they created, they usually got a lot of fame and respect in the music industry. First and foremost, what I'm going to do is list the members of the Beatles. Now, the origination history of the Beatles is a little complicated because it kind of started with groupings of the different members and eventually they all came together, but it was like separate bands that kind of merged into one. Because first you had John Lennon and Paul McCartney who were together because John Lennon was a part of a group called the Quarrymen around 1956-1957. In some cases with music groups, new members are brought in, old members are switched out or replaced, and that was kind of the case with George Harrison who joined in 1958. Because you had the situation with Paul McCartney and John Lennon who knew each other pretty well and were in the Quarrymen, and then George Harrison came along and he was like, can I audition? And that kind of took a while, but then he did slowly and surely get into the band. Additionally, you had members like Stuart Sutcliffe and Pete Best who really aren't known as well, mainly because they didn't stay in the band as long, but they also helped with the instruments around the 1960s. But the band itself wasn't really complete until 1962 when Pete Best was switched out with Ringo Starr to play on the drums. And this is skipping some stuff, but there were definitely complications with Pete Best's performance in the band. I think it was Paul McCartney who didn't necessarily like the style of how he played, so they brought in Ringo Starr in 1962 to replace him. So essentially, in terms of origination, the Beatles started out in the 1960s. They didn't just start out as the Beatles because it went from the Quarrymen to the Beatles, that was kind of spelled weird, to the Silver Beatles, and then finally to the Beatles. I would also like to briefly mention the different managers that the Beatles had. Now, some of these managers, like the first one, Alan Williams, was pretty much a manager that held the job of figuring out where the Beatles needed to play. And then you had longer lasting and official managers like Brian Epstein, who not only got the Beatles to where they needed to go to play, but he also dealt with the financial side of things. Following along with that, you had other managers like Alan Klein, who focused more so on the financial side of things. And this is definitely skipping ahead, but the current technical manager of the Beatles would be John Branca, who kind of handles the label overall. So going back more so into the history side of things, as I mentioned, the Beatles started out around the 1960s, but the way that they did so was playing in clubs. And specifically location-wise, a lot of the early clubs that the Beatles played at were in Hamburg, Germany, and that was just kind of the easiest way to do so because when you're a band that's starting out, you don't necessarily go play at concerts, so the early managers of the Beatles just found them different spots to play at. Now this is skipping some of the music stuff, which I'll go back into, but I do kind of want to go into first the tour and the movie side of the Beatles. Overall, the 1960s was such a bombardment and quick transition into fame and touring because they started touring out in countries like England, Sweden, just overall Europe. But go to the date of February 7th of 1964, that was the day when the Beatles first came to the United States, which obviously was the first time that they did so, so that was like mind-blowing for everyone who already loved their music. Which in 1964 was the same year that the Beatles held their world tour, which went to places like Denmark, the Netherlands, Hong Kong, and Australia. The last commercial tour that the Beatles did was on August 29th of 1964, so overall 1964 was just a big year for touring for the Beatles. If I can find the exact number of how many tours they did throughout their career, I'll try to put it on screen, but overall it was intense. I would also like to briefly mention the different movies that the Beatles participated in, whether that was actually them acting or having their songs included. There are quite a few. The first ever film/movie that the Beatles associated themselves with was A Hard Day's Night, followed by Help, Magical Mystery Tour, as well as Yellow Submarine. Yellow Submarine is a bit abstract. I mean, technically they're all abstract, so if you're someone who doesn't necessarily like really weird movies, maybe don't watch them, but it's the Beatles, so if you like the Beatles, probably watch them. Now I'm gonna go back to actually discussing the Beatles' music. So once again, it's a little convoluted as to state what was the actual first Beatles song, because you had the Quarrymen with like John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, like the early years, but then you have the actual Beatles. So it really just depends on who you're asking, but That'll Be the Day as well as Love Me Do are equally kind of held as being like the first Beatles songs. And then in terms of the actual first album that the Beatles ever released, that was Please Please Love Me in 1963, which the Beatles have quite a lot of albums. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band was in 1967, which is also kind of a wacky but fun album. Magical Mystery Tour was 1967. You have the White cover album, which is the Beatles in 1968. Yellow Submarine, 1969. Abbey Road, which is a really famous album, was also in 1969. Let It Be is another famous album, 1970. They literally just got so much music, it's crazy. If you've never listened to a single Beatles song, but you like music, but you don't know what genres they play, it's kind of like rock, pop, and psychedelic music. Which, once again, that really just depends on who you're asking, because some people like certain Beatles songs. Like, some of the Beatles songs are, Yay, Happy Romance, I Want to Hold Your Hand. But then some of them are I Am the Walrus and Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, and they don't necessarily make sense, but that's the fun of listening to them. Now, this is skipping so much history, but in terms of the termination and kind of end of the Beatles, that was officially documented on December 29th of 1974. And there are quite a few theories and reasons as to why the Beatles broke up, one of the biggest ones being that there were kind of some tensions between band members. For example, you had people like John Lennon and Paul McCartney, who usually did a lot of the singing and word making for the songs. But then you also had people like George Harrison, who created a lot of the words for the songs, but he usually wasn't the one to like be the lead vocalist, so there were kind of some tensions with that. There were also some issues that sprang up with how many times the Beatles went on tour. Like, they eventually just kind of got tired of it, so they kind of stopped. But in terms of the impact, the Beatles in general are usually considered to be one of the biggest bands in the world. And two of the terms usually used to describe the impact that the Beatles had was either Beatlemania or the British invasion, which basically just encompasses the amount of support that people had for the Beatles and how much they loved their music, so people would just go crazy wherever they were. Another big impact that the Beatles had in general would be their drug usage history. As I briefly mentioned, there are songs like Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds that kind of resulted from the experimentation with different drugs that the Beatles used. George Harrison was one of the members who was more so into the whole psychedelic thing, which resulted in quite a few odd and very obscure songs, but ones that are still pretty important and pretty influential in their music history. Another big thing a lot of people remember the Beatles for would be their hairstyles and clothing styles. I know that one of the bigger eras for the Beatles is when they kind of had that shorter hair. Personally, and this is nothing against any of them, I liked when they all kind of had longer hair. I thought it looked good. Another big influence that the Beatles made with their music was the fact that they usually discussed and brought up politics in their music. And sometimes it wasn't through the actual lyrics in their songs, but it was when they would go to perform their songs. Like in the US, when there was kind of topics and the issues of segregation, sometimes they wouldn't play at venues because they were like, that is literally just so uncool. And when you have a band that's really influential and a lot of people like them, when they have songs that kind of speak out against injustices, it's kind of hard to ignore it. Of course, over time, the Beatles have been recognized with various awards to kind of commemorate their efforts towards the music industry. Literally, the Queen even gave them awards. She was like, good job, guys. And a lot of their music has been recognized by like the Rolling Stones and like Academy Awards, and like a lot of their songs just stay on the top charts because they're that good. And in terms of my general opinion, personally, I like the Beatles. I think one of my biggest regrets currently is the fact that I went to London, but I didn't go to Abbey Road, so I didn't get like the really epic like going against the crosswalk picture, but maybe in the future. I also have a few things. Unfortunately, I only have the Abbey Road album, but it's also one of my favorites, so I can't complain too much. I also have the Beatles Complete Chord Songbook, which is really helpful because I play the piano and the guitar, so if you're someone who plays an instrument, I would definitely recommend this. I would also definitely recommend if you can see the movie called Yesterday, which is based on one of the Beatles songs, and it's a relatively newer movie. It's really good and it's really fun, so if you like the Beatles, I would suggest listening to it or watching it. Out of everyone in like the main Beatles group, I would have to say that Paul McCartney is my favorite. I did a video kind of talking about it a while ago, but I actually got to go see Paul McCartney live, which was so cool, such a fun dude, so good with music. And there definitely are occasions where the Beatles have gained some controversy, especially with the treatment of some of their children and wives, which is definitely a difficult issue. And of course you have absolutely upsetting occasions like the murder of John Lennon by a man who literally just wanted the fame of doing that, which is absolutely horrible. But overall, I think that it's practically impossible for really anyone to say that the Beatles haven't had some impact on music history. So that's essentially the answer to the question. So if you have any questions, let me know and I'll get to working on them as soon as I can, but that's about it. So thank you very much for watching. Bye.